trust you've all had a good lunch, and it's quite obvious that some of our colleagues will be joining us shortly. Today's panel is about corporate social responsibility. It's a buzzword that's used quite often and, in fact, sometimes overstated. In the West, in the UK where I live, for example, they've even dropped the term CSR. They call it corporate sustainability. Today on our panel, we have 4 distinguished individuals from different backgrounds who are going to speak to us regarding what they see as corporate social responsibility, and in particular, whether it's having an impact in education. I'll start from over here. We have Nick Fuller. Nick is the founder of a marketing agency called EdComs in the UK that specializes in creating CSR strategies for education initiatives. We have Sunny Varkey, who is the founder and chairman of GEMS Education, and as you know, my boss. So easy questions, please. We have Shankar, who could be my boss. Shankar is the chief executive of half the world, as I said, for Standard Chartered Bank. But more importantly, he's also on the advisory board of the Varkey GEMS Foundation. And last but not least, we have my friend Tox from Nigeria. Tox is the chief executive of a foundation called the Oando Foundation, which is, and Oando is a company, it's an oil and gas company in Nigeria. We actually met last year in New York, where they undertook a commitment for $10 million to sponsor schools in Nigeria. So the format for today's session is quite simple. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for about 5 minutes, tell us what they do, tell us what their experience is, and then we'll go into an interactive format where I'll ask questions to start with, but you will have the opportunity to quiz these 4 very, very clever people as to what they are doing in corporate social responsibility. So if I may, Nick.
Thank you, Vikas, and good afternoon, and thanks for coming to our session. I've been lucky enough over the last 18 years to develop a dual perspective on corporate social responsibility as it works through education. First, because, as Vikas says, 18 years ago I founded a company called EdComs, which exists almost exclusively to build CSR programs and to measure and evaluate their success. And we concentrate on programs in education. And so over the last 18 years, I've worked with banks, telecoms companies, FMCG, retail, automotive, oil and gas, technology, publishing, media companies, all of which were working with us to build effective and sustainable educational CSR programs. And then 6 years ago, an extraordinary thing happened, which was that I was approached and asked to become the head of education for the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And so I went on what must be one of the world's largest secondments and headed up the education function for the London Games. And that was fascinating as well, because we built one of the largest education programs I think ever delivered by a modern games organizing committee. And part of doing that was by working with all of our sponsors and suppliers and commercial partners and encouraging them to activate through educational CSR to bring their sponsorship to life by making a difference to young people, because anybody who is British here may remember that when we won the bid, one of the key planks of winning the bid was that we said we would use the power of the games to inspire young children. And so education was a key part of how that happened, and I was privileged enough to be in charge of that operation. And I thought that what I would do to start this off, as all of the distinguished people to my left are people who are principals in terms of delivering educational CSR programs from a corporate perspective, and because I am looking at it as a consultant, I thought what I might do would just be to share 5 or 6 key points that I think are noticeably present in most successful educational CSR programs. And the first is the ability to define our terms. You know, corporate social responsibility, corporate sustainability, whatever one calls it, is now accepted, I think, by most commercial ventures in the developed world as a mandatory part of their communication strategy and part of the way in which they embed themselves in their own communities. But I think it is very different to philanthropy, and I think it is also very different to some of the fascinating things we heard this morning about public-private partnerships. I think corporate social responsibility can make a huge difference to education, but I think it is a particular kind of animal. When we developed our programs with the Olympics and Paralympics sponsors, we knew that many of those programs would only last for the 4 or 5 years that we were in existence. Some of them would continue, some of them were actually driven by the sponsorship of the Olympic Games. And these were, corporate social responsibility initiatives. They had a huge impact on young people. They ran in different fields: sustainability education, science, technology, engineering, and maths education. And they made a huge impact very, very quickly. We also set up a global charity called the International Inspiration Foundation, which I was lucky enough to be a trustee of. And that was about delivering Lord Coe's message that we would inspire young people all around the world. And this was actually a project where we raised nearly £50 million, and we developed programs in 20 developing nations around the world which used sport as a key driver to enhance the lives of young people. Now, when we took that to our commercial partners, many of them looked at it and said, this is an incredibly attractive proposition, but you need to speak to our foundations. This is not what we would classify as corporate social responsibility, but we think, for example, the GE Foundation gifted us $1 million. And it was very interesting to see how the sponsors, in their own minds, were clear about, what is foundation giving, what is actually something that we put in our annual review and we report back to stakeholders and shareholders. And I think that's, people who understand those differences, that's a critical part of getting it right, because you understand what your goals are and how to measure them. The second is that, in my experience, companies who are very successful in corporate social responsibility have an incredibly clear idea about who their end audience is. Clearly, world-class education for young people is a mandatory part of delivering a successful educational CSR program. But you may be wishing to do that because you want to involve policymakers, because you actually want to involve your own staff and use it as a way of communicating with your own staff, because you want to involve teachers, you want to involve young people, or you want to involve families. And unless, when you set off, you have a very clear idea of who the key principals are and who the key participants are, things will get quite muddled quite soon. And so that has been a characteristic of some of the most successful programs we've worked with. The third is that companies who are successful in this market always apply the same discipline to CSR, which is a relatively new phenomenon, to the discipline that they would apply elsewhere, either in their marcoms or in their operational structures. And I think that the three principles we see are longevity, consistency, and quality. And those are very important. CSR by definition cannot necessarily be a lifetime's commitment. But being consistent and having a clearly defined scale of operation so that teachers and schools know what to expect and for how long to expect it, that's a very important part of getting it right. Fourth, one of our premises is that wherever possible, companies are most successful in this sphere when they contribute to education using their core expertise, their core knowledge, their core skills. Companies can be successful by sponsoring something or paying for something which is sort of entirely separate to what they do. And I think one has to make a real exception in these generalities when one is talking about territories of high deprivation, where one is looking at building basic literacy, basic numeracy, basic understanding. But in outside of those markets, I think that when you see companies sharing their core understanding of the world and showing how education can be brought to life, applying theory to practice, that is incredibly successful. And that's the route that a huge number of Olympic and Paralympic sponsors took, showing how the disciplines that they were applying to the delivery of the Olympic or Paralympic Games translated what people learnt into the classroom into a real-life application. There was a real resonance there. And consumers, in every piece of research I've ever seen, also have a better understanding of why they are doing that. Somewhere in the audience, we have some people from Lego. A huge plank of the Lego corporate social responsibility and foundation activity is to do with play as an enabling force for young people. Now, understanding why Lego would be using play as a basic tenet of, their charitable and corporate social responsibility activity is very easy for people to understand, and they clearly have a huge bank of knowledge. Similarly, engineering companies, oil and gas companies contributing to engineering. So, okay, Vikas is tapping, which probably means I'm talking for too long, so I'll move on. Or maybe he's just tapping because he's bored. This is an important one. Companies who are successful in this market should always spend more on measurement and an evaluation than they want to. There's always a huge impulse from the best motivations to say what we're spending on measurement and evaluation is money we're not spending with young people. But actually to have longevity and to grow a really successful program, you need to measure. You need to be testing your focus on specific outcomes and outputs. You need to be measuring the progress you're making against the goals you've set. You need to be having a feedback loop where you use research to refine and redevelop your program. And also, and this is something we saw a lot in the Olympic and Paralympic sponsors, you need to capture serendipity. The things that you didn't set out to do but are happening and are incredibly positive. You need to feed that into your overall learning so that the program continues to live. Okay, and my last point, I think that there is, and I would say this, wouldn't I? I think there is a rapidly emerging and incredibly exciting area of educational corporate social responsibility which is built around sport. The Olympics has education built into its DNA. Its founder, Pierre de Coubertin, said an Olympics is sport, culture, and education. But when you look at the macro change and the micro change you can deliver through an Olympics, and then you look around the world at global sporting events and the huge impact they have on young people, I think you also see more and more educational activity being built into the way in which sponsors activate their participation in those events. I think that is an incredibly exciting thing, and we have seen the inspiration that sport can bring through some of our programs, empowering young women, driving attendance at school, taking people who are possibly on the verge of dropping out into what we call NEETs, not in education, employment or training. We have seen the power of sport to bring them back into a learning environment. And I think that there are major sports events happening in every continent over the next 3 to 5 years. Okay, so what's my overriding thought about this market? The whole is still nowhere near the sum of the parts. There's a huge amount of inspiring activity going on, but there's too much churn, too much reinvention of the wheel, and some that is peripheral to teachers' needs. And I think Vikas asked me to finish with one view about what the future might be. I think one of the really exciting things about this area is something that my colleagues earlier today have talked about hugely, which is partnerships. I think technology makes the aggregation of effort and the ability to learn from what has happened elsewhere in the world and apply those learnings possible in a way that it has never been before. corporate social responsibility is, I think, a really exciting and rapidly growing area. And I will leave you with that.
Thank you very much, Nick. Just a quick question. Nick, do you have children?
I have 2 children, 2 daughters.
Do they need Lego?
We haven't discussed that yet. I just had lunch with the Lego people.
I feel my colleagues from there are going to send you a big bucket of Lego bricks. I want to move on actually to talks at the end over there.
Okay.
We speak about, there's a lot of focus on Africa over here, and Nigeria being Africa's largest country, and Oando being such a major private sector operator. I wanted to hear your view on corporate social responsibility.
Okay. Good afternoon. I think I have to start by explaining what our mission is in Oando. And our mission is to radically improve the quality of teaching and learning in our schools and community by providing access to world-class education. As we know, Nigeria has 10.5 million children between the age of 6 and 14 out of school. Oando takes its workforce from Nigeria, so we have to ensure we educate our workforce. In addition, Nigeria has the Vision 2020 to be one of the 20 top economies by 2020. And for us to be able to achieve that, we have to invest in our human capital. There's no doubt about that. Most of the other corporates in Nigeria focus on secondary and university education. And we have said we will focus on primary education because we need to catch those kids at a very early stage. The PLC, which is the Oando Group, is supporting us by giving us a donation every year to run the foundation. We work strictly with the government. It's truly a public-private partnership. We work with the State Universal Education Board, and we work with the Universal Basic Education Commission. Each state has certain differences on how the schools should be refurbished or how they should be done. So we work closely with them, even identifying the schools that we want to adopt. And our approach is a whole developmental approach. We go in, we renovate the schools because most of the schools that we have are dilapidated. They're in terrible conditions. Some kids even learn under the tree. There are no blackboards. Worst case, they don't even have electricity, no sanitation. So what happens is, for a child to use the toilet, they go home and end up not coming back to school. So we ensure that there's water and sanitation in those schools. Teacher training, I think we've talked a lot about teacher training because we can do all the brick and mortar, but if the teachers are not well equipped to teach the pupils, there's a problem. So I won't flog that issue because we all realize that it's something that is very important and it's something that we are also working on. We also work on scholarships. Now, we do primary education, but we give the kids scholarships to go to secondary school. Secondary school is actually free in Nigeria, but parents don't allow their kids to go because they have to buy the uniform, they have to buy the textbooks, they have to buy the school books. They can't afford to. They have to pay for lunch while they're in school. They'd rather have their kids go and hawk on the streets than go to secondary school. So we actually take 10 children from each of our adopted schools to go on to secondary school based on a certain criteria. We have 225 kids on scholarship right now. By the end of this year, we'll have 745 kids. I'll give you an example of a girl in the north. A 13-year-old girl, she scored the highest in the north, and we informed her parents that we were going to give her a scholarship to go to secondary school. Her parents absolutely refused. They said they wanted her to marry. I couldn't get to the north on time because apparently the girl was a mess because she really wanted to further her education. The government intervened for me, the State Universal Basic Education Board. They had a meeting with the parents, assured the parents that Oando will pay for everything the girl needs. I quickly developed an MOU with SUBEB to assure them that this partnership is not just talk. We're going to walk the talk. And thankfully, her parents allowed her to go to school. I actually invited her to Lagos when we're launching the scholarship, and my heart melted when I saw the girl because I could not believe that was the girl they wanted to go and marry. Small thing. So that's a success story for us. I think the Prime Minister also talked about ICT. none of the public schools have computers. So what we've done is we've turned their library into an ICT lab so that they can have world-class education. And then we're training the teachers as well. Now, I believe the figure is about 22 million children in Nigeria are supposed to have early child care. Only 2 million of those children have early child care. So 20 million children actually do not go to school between the ages of 3 and 4. The classrooms are there in the school, but there are no tools, there are no teachers to teach the children. So we're going to ensure that every single school we adopt has an early childhood care. This also frees up the mothers to go and work, which impacts the economy at the end of the day. We work closely with the community. As an oil and gas company, we used to be charged ridiculous amount to renovate the schools. So what we now do is we actually enter the community and have workers and artisans in the community help us renovate the school. We actually work with the parents, with the State Universal Education Board, with the local government. We put a committee together and they help us build the school, and our engineers and quantity surveyor will do the quality check to ensure it meets the standards. At the moment, we have 28 schools adopted in 8 states. By mid-year, we would have 52 schools adopted in 23 states. However, we have challenges. When we train our teachers, they can be transferred to other schools. So we have to look for ways to retain our teachers, because that's a huge investment for us, and if they're transferred, there's a problem. There are no statistics, there are no data, because the local government staff members are not well equipped to collect data, or they might not even have the tools, the basic computers. So we have a staff volunteer team who will also go out there to train the local government, the communities, the people in the communities. There's actually what we call school-based management community in each state. These are volunteers in the society made up of parents, individuals who are interested in governing the public schools. So we work closely with them, we mentor them to ensure they focus on our schools, that there are no school absenteeism, the teachers are there. But there's still a long way to go because we need them to keep going to the schools every single day. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Toks. It's very interesting to hear what you're doing. Shankar, you work for a bank. Tell us about your corporate social responsibility.
Thank you, Vikas. First of all, I'd like to thank Sunny and James for having me here. You guys run great schools, do a great amount of good stuff for the world at large. And I know you personally. You're simply one of the most charitable, philanthropic human beings I've ever met. So thank you very much. I think you deserve a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Let me just, before I talk about what Standard Chartered does in this area, because if I
Sure.
may, let me just address the issue of CSR, because I've got some views on this. If you take the last 15, 20 years, CSR has been a mantra for virtually every business. Everybody is talking about CSR. But I'd be also right in saying in the last 15, 20 years, the trust that societies have in businesses has deteriorated sharply. So why is it that companies and businesses are investing more and more in CSR, and yet societal trust in businesses has diminished? It is a paradox. And I think it's because companies tend to view CSR as something you do in the periphery and something that what you do in the business as the core. I think the core and the periphery need to come together. Companies often take the attitude that, let me go and pollute the atmosphere, but then if I give $5 million for AIDS prevention, I'm okay. It is almost like the Hindu belief that you can sin for life, but you go and get a dip in the Ganges and then all your sins go away. You have to, I think, have a scenario where you have to think about creating shared value and your periphery and the core need to come together. So which is why at Standard Chartered we believe that we got to focus on our business, that we are fit for purpose and we are good and we're doing good to society in the businesses that we do. No amount of CSR activity we do, whether it's for education or healthcare, can quite match the impact we can have on society through the businesses that we conduct. So for us, lending to SMEs, we lend more than $20 billion to SMEs, creates millions and millions of jobs globally. It dwarfs any CSR activity we do. The work we do on sustainable finance, we have lent almost $10 billion for renewable energy projects around the world, does more for the environment than any CSR activity we can do in this scenario. The amount of money we lend to microfinance institutions is estimated to have created 5.5 million jobs over the last decade. So I could go on and on about, that the contribution we make to the real economy, the contribution we make to sustainability through the activities that we do, I think is very, very important. So let's not lose sight of it. And that's not only important for Standard Chartered, I think it's important for Oando, it's important for GEMS, because the fact that you educate, provide high-class, world-class education to 110,000 students is as important as what GEMS Foundation does. Turning specifically to a few things that we have done in the area of education. The biggest program, most of Standard Chartered's efforts has been focused actually on healthcare. Our biggest program is Seeing is Believing, where we have looked at curable blindness, cataract surgeries, and so on, and we've impacted the lives of 28 million people over the last decade. We have raised over $100 million for that effort, and it's climbing. But that's our core program. But having said that, on education, a few years ago, we embarked on a program called GOAL, and it has got a sporting metaphor, and it probably, exactly what Nick said. What we looked at was working with other charitable organizations and NGOs, getting girls, particularly from the lower income bracket, in deprived societies. And this was after class, getting them together to play sports. And whether it was football or netball or basketball, whatever was relevant in these markets. And it was not just about playing sports, it was about using that as the mechanism, as the framework to actually teach them about financial literacy. It was about teaching them about how to improve their health. It was about making them more socially relevant. And our goal, for GOAL, is to have at least 100,000 girls, adolescent girls, through that program over the next 3 to 4 years. I think we have reached something like 20 to 25,000 to date. And we have done it in a few markets: China, India, Jordan, Nigeria, and Zambia. And it's working well. The second area where we have focused on, and comes back again to Nick's point about building around your core competence. The biggest thing that banks can do is actually promote financial literacy. So a lot of our effort is actually going into working with NGOs, governments, educational departments on delivering financial literacy, particularly to the, not just to women, but also to the less literate sections of society. The third area that we have tended to focus on is employee volunteering, because I think that can have as much of an impact as giving money. Why can't, for instance, people in our project finance team who know all about water conservation go and volunteer in schools and teach kids about water conservation, because water is going to be a big issue? Why can't people in our finance department go and help schools improve their finances? Why can't people in our human resources department go and work with schools in terms of improving the way that they manage their staff retention? So last year, not just for education, but our total employee volunteering hours globally was close to about 75,000 hours. And this is something we just started 2-3 years ago. So that's another area where we think we can have impact. The fourth area, which we have again focused on broadly in the area of education, is health-based education, particularly in Africa, where teaching a lot of people about HIV and AIDS. And we made commitments to, at the Clinton Global Initiative, and we have far exceeded it. Educating millions of people on prevention, I think, is also useful. The last one, and then I'll shut up, is when you look at banks today, we all process stuff, remittances and payments, etc., in what we would call operation centers. But today, technology allows you to actually disaggregate that entire processing. So there are elements of processing that you no longer need college graduates to do. For somebody to key in the name of a remitter or the amount, you don't need to be a college graduate. You can take it to just school leavers in absolutely impoverished areas. Also today, the communication and technology allows you to actually sit in Dubai, process a payment for a customer in London using resources somewhere in the foothills of India. And that's precisely what we are doing today. We are, for instance, as one of our early experiments in this, we have taken a tribal district in Nilgiris, which is in South India, and taken 30 or 40 tribal girls, school leavers, who otherwise would have no access to jobs, probably will get married off pretty early. Instead, taught them a little bit about how to operate a computer, how to key in stuff, basic stuff, and they're helping us process stuff. So this is, again, I think it's good for the community. It's also good for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shankar. So I know there's quite a lot of people here waiting to hear from you, Mr. Varkey. Your name's on the tin, as it were. What was your thinking when you came up with the Varkey Gems Foundation?
First of all, I should thank you for the kind words, Shankar. And I must congratulate Vikas and team, Mark. So far,
you shouldn't smile when you're saying that.
So far, the Davos of education. I think all of you have done an excellent job. My story is very simple. I've been fortunate to be born in a family where giving was the norm, even when they had, as they call, peanuts. Sometimes when I tell some of my colleagues that even when my father was earning $10,000 US, we still gave 10% plus to charity. I think I personally believe that giving, again, is not just about money, but giving could be in many forms of maybe listening to somebody's problems, maybe visiting somebody in a hospital, and so on and so forth. But we've been doing almost all in so many years. When you have this pedigree and you want to do something for the community, there are so many issues in the world where you need support. There is the research that people spend money on AIDS. There is people who are suffering from cancer, and so on and so forth. There are CSR work that what Nick is doing, what you're doing. But going back to what Nick said, our core strength is in education. And when you got thousands of teachers, thousands of school children, and thousands of parents, you tend to leverage this infrastructure that you have. And that's what we have done. And for me, again, education is probably the most important thing in the world today, and that's why I guess everybody, when you talk about the Education Forum, you find everybody from every part of the world want to participate in this sort of a forum. So we chose education simply because, apart from being in that industry, it also helps to reduce poverty. It helps to reduce conflicts, intolerance, and of course, it is also able to build better communities, and therefore we are fortunate in that sense. My inspiration also came from a few years back when His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum when you launched the Dubai CARES, and this is just out of the blue, His Highness launched the program, and we were very touched upon that initiative, and we started being one of the major contributors to the Dubai CARES. And so the whole sort of inspiration of starting the foundation came from there. And also, we had lots of encouragement from President Bill Clinton. So together, about a couple of years back, we said, let's formalize the givings that the group has been doing for so many years, and we formed the Varkey Gems Foundation. And the whole idea was obviously to through our children, through our teachers, through our parents, to spread the concept of giving.
Thank you very much, Mr. Varkey. The theme of this conference as a whole is to do with public-private partnerships. And we look at what President Clinton said yesterday, which was that governments can't do it by themselves. And I know we have a number of policymakers and education ministers in the room as well. I think, Tox, you spoke about working with the government. Tell us about your experience of how you can make CSR programs successful when working with governments.
Communication. If you go in there thinking, I'm the corporate, I'm the dynamic one, I know more than them, they'll probably frustrate your efforts. So you have to engage with them very early. You have to share your plans, engage with the lowest and the highest people in the government agencies, because they all matter. And you have to be able to sell your story. And you have to tell them that you're going into a partnership with them, and you're not going to run and do it on their own, because they are still the owners of those agencies. You cannot change the education policies without the government bodies. So you have to work with them very closely, engage, communicate, communicate, communicate. I can't overemphasize that.
Nick?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely 100% right. And one of the things that we worked on, although this is maybe 10 years now, is we were approached by the schools minister in England, a fantastically inspiring woman called Estelle Morris. And she had identified an issue, which was that sometimes civil servants and people in corporates don't speak quite the same language. And she had decided to put out to tender an opportunity for there to be a kind of interface which did exactly what you're talking about. And what it did was act as a possibility for policymakers to say, look, these are our key policies, and we don't necessarily want financial support to deliver them, but we want to understand how the commercial sector could help us. And for commercial people to say, these are the skills that we would like to see being developed in school leavers. And it set up a really interesting neutral space where incredibly effective dialogue took place. And that led to much stronger partnerships because there was efficiency, there was open communication, and also there was a forum in which people could talk about things where there may not be a partnership, but each side had quite a strong point of view. That was very effective, and in the end, it was all about communication.
Before I ask my next question, in fact, to you, Mr. Varkey, I just want to make everyone be aware that I will be taking questions. So after I've asked the question, and whilst he's answering, please do indicate if you want to ask a question. We'll take them in threes, and I hope the microphones are ready at the back to choose people. You know, one of the things that our panelists have spoken about is the word impact. I know Shankar spoke about what the business impact of what the programs are. I know Tok spoke about the education landscape in Nigeria. I know that Nick has also addressed this question. What is your view on impact?
Well, you know, our impact is through our children, because one of the things that all the GEM schools follow is that we are all about character building, we are all about values, we are all about global citizenship. And I think in today's world, with so many crises that's going on in the world, I think it's very, very important that children are taught to give in different forms. And so last year, I think we had approximately 200 events done by children, how to help people, how to give, and so on and so forth. So I think so that's one of our way of how through which we are able to teach the children about giving, and you know, we are also using the teachers. We have signed an agreement with UNESCO to train around 10,000 head teachers, which will again impact probably millions of children around the world. We also signed an agreement with UNESCO for training 250,000 teachers. So it's different form of impact that we do in helping the underprivileged of the world. And also our children have been, again, you know, capable enough to raise probably, I don't know, maybe about $500,000 US for a school in the slums in Nairobi. So I think you know, when everybody does their own thing in a small way, people looking at a group like GEMS, other schools also will be able to do the same thing and have a much more impact in the world as you go forward.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm open to questions. Please, before you ask your question, can you please introduce yourself? I know that we have a colleague at the front over here. Please, if you stand up when you're asking your question.
Yeah. My name is Venkat, and my initiative is called educationforall.info. The Varkey Foundation and GEM School has been really supportive for this initiative, wherein I have been collecting pencils, eraser, sharpener, and stationery and sending across to India. Around this year, 20,000 plus children will be benefited by that initiative. My question is how these small gestures can make a big difference, and how the same can be inculcated in all the individuals.
Thank you very much. Next question, over here on the left. Is that the Lego table?
Hello everyone, my name's Jess and I work for a charity called DebateMate. We teach key 21st century skills through debating in schools and areas of high child poverty. And we did some work over the summer with Standard Chartered, kindly supported by Standard Chartered in Zambia, working with the CEO, Mzinga Melu, I think. We were just looking at your website and there's a feature of DebateMate on there. But it was an incredibly successful program and loads and loads of Standard Chartered staff volunteered. So we definitely agree. I mean, the staff made a huge difference. We evaluate our programs really, really well, and we know that as a result of the program that we did in Rwanda, and we're also working in Zambia, that it had a massive impact. My question really for everyone, but particularly for you and for Tokes, is how we'd go about expanding this across the whole of Africa, and what kind of role someone like Standard Chartered or CSR or the government could play within that.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions? At the back? They're all at the front. All the questions at the front. Over here, please. Right in front of you, sir.
My name's Mehul Sangrachka. I'm the CEO of Learning Possibilities. We provide online learning platforms and development for teachers. I just wanted to follow up on something Nick said, which was that good CSR has strong targets and good measurement. And I wonder if you could give us some examples of that so that we can understand the motivation that corporates have behind education CSR.
Great. If we start with that question, Nick.
Yeah, sure. I think it's I think that as the CSR industry has progressed, it's moved from a sense where reach is important to a point where impact is important. So it's not just how many people you reach, it's how much difference do you actually make. And this was particularly important for us when we set up the International Inspiration Programme at London 2012, because our stated ambition was to reach 12 million young people in 20 nations around the world. 2012, you see what we did there. and use sport to enhance their lives. Now, measuring inspiration and measuring enhancement is an incredibly complicated and quite a vague thing. We employed all of the civil servants who worked on it for the UK government, did a huge amount of work on the log frame and thinking about, inputs and what likely outputs would be. And we also employed an external consultancy called Ecorus to actually build an evaluation framework which said, okay, if you've got a program in India which is using sport to empower young women and give them status in their communities and build their profile, and then you've got an activity in Africa which is using sport as a means of bringing young people together so that you can educate them about HIV, then for each territory and for each discipline, you have to have a very clear sense about how you're going to measure what you've communicated and how successfully you've communicated it. And we built a systematic measurement like that. And similarly, with our domestic sponsors or with any of EdCom's UK clients, we always want to say at the beginning of the relationship, look, what does success look like? So that you can build, a model which says, this is what success looks like. The huge challenge with evaluating CSR in education is that essentially you need to build a longitudinal model, and there are relatively few corporates who remain in the market for long enough. And even when you've built the longitudinal model, how do you disaggregate the other factors? But if you're very clear at the beginning about what you want to measure and what success looks like, then you can do it on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. We also had a question, I think it was on scalability. Maybe, Shankar, you can answer that question.
Ladies first.
Ladies first. Toks.
Scalability.
Okay, go ahead. I think your question was about how can we expand, how can we scale? I think it's a very good question. It's about scale. And the only way you can scale is by two things in my mind. One is McDonaldize everything. I.e., how do you, McDonald's is the repeat formula for everything, and you got to figure out a way of how do you do it. And the second is about massively replicating it. And the third, I would say, is, which I find, is a lot of different organizations approach us with roughly the same program. How do we get these various NGOs to actually collaborate? Because I think they'll be far more powerful. The last thing I would say is you need to use some early adopters and where you've had successes to become your actual champions. So for instance, in your case, if you had success in Zambia and Rwanda, you should be using Standard Chartered in Zambia to actually champion your cause, and Standard Chartered in South Africa, Angola, Nigeria, whatever. I think so. Those would be the quick response I would give.
Toks.
The only thing I'll add to that is always pilot, especially when you want to go into loads of places. Pilot, because for us, we've seen that each state in Nigeria is peculiar. So you can't just say that because you're doing something in the north, you can also do it in the south. Or you want to start, even the ICT lab, we're going to pilot them before we roll out to ensure that we get the right formula, because you can't scale up quickly if you don't have the right formula at the very beginning.
Thank you very much. Mr. Varkey, can small gestures make a big difference?
Very much so. I think I always believe that each one, well, let me just give a small story which Sheikh Nayan said to some people last year. There was a fire, and all the animals did not know what to do. And there was a small bird who started going to the river, taking some water and sort of going and pouring on top of the fire to put it down. And all these big animals were standing on the side and laughing, saying, what is that small bird going to do with this, And when they were laughing, the small bird looked back and said, at least I'm doing something, whereas you guys are standing on the side. So I think by each of us doing our own little bit, I think you can make a difference in the world.
Great response. Any more questions? I know that Radha at the front is asking, wants to ask a question. We also have this gentleman who already has a mic in his hand. We'll go to him first, Radha. I promise I'll come to you.
My name is Nam Sigli from Korea, and I very strongly support the idea of Mr. Shankar about creating shared value. And corporate social responsibility is a responsibility. It does not go last long. So using our core competence, even in the educational field, we should develop more creative values. If we do not increase the size of pie, we cannot solve the problems. So just delivering the normal education to everywhere in the world, that's a past model. And depending upon the necessity on the regional necessities, we should develop more rigorous educational schemes to develop their society. So I believe that that's the real corporate social responsibility for the educational institution. Thank you.
Radha.
Good afternoon. I am Radha Krishnan, Senior Director, GEMS Education and Head of Chairman's Office. I have a question for you, Shankar. We all know as business leaders that human resources and talent is the most important asset for any organization. Just think about, consider either your bank or GEMS Education or any organization recruiting, say 1,000 people in a year. And consider putting a value that has gone into making these young men and women who is joining us, the amount of investment that has gone into making those people productive members whose benefits will be drawn by us as businesses. Two types of investments would have gone into it, two sources. One, the parents of those young men and women would have invested in their education. And society at large, state included, various arms of society would have invested in making those individuals as productive members of society. So when we take those people into our organization, there is a huge investment in terms of value that is coming in. So while we pay a salary to these individuals for their livelihood, where are we paying back to those investments? The investments which is huge in value, who is paying for it? And in your initial remarks, you talked about periphery and core, and many businesses undertaking social responsibility as a peripheral activity. My question to you is, what will be your advice to the policymakers, representatives of governments who might be present in this room, to make a change, to reduce the gap between the periphery and core?
It's a really good question. We'll take one more in this series. Any others? In the middle of the room there. Can you stick your hand up again, please, so the mic can come to you?
My name is Paramjit Pabi. I'm the Group HR Director of a large group called Dangote Group in Nigeria. I would like to make a comment actually, but I would also request if anybody from the panel could,
if you could keep your comment short, please.
Yeah, the comment is, we have heard around the table and across the room that corporate social responsibility is a way of giving back to society. It's good corporate, it's good citizenship. But my own personal view is, apart from all these laudable objectives, it is also a business imperative. Take the case of Tata Steel in Jamshedpur in India. They have been doing CSR, which used to be called community development in the 50, 60, 70 years ago. And the kind of work they have done at the grassroots level in the communities around their factories has been so great that it's brought in so much harmony in terms of industrial relations that they hadn't had strikes for the last 70 years. There's continuity, so it's basically a license to operate. I would like any of the panelists to say something if they have anything else to share on this account.
Great. We'll ask the question that was posed directly to Shankar first.
Rather, your question about periphery versus the core, what when we do to reduce the gap. I think there is, the debate of late has been a kind of a false trade-off debate. A trade-off between social progress and economic efficiency. Actually, they are inextricably intertwined and interlinked. I don't think you can make social progress unless there is economic progress. And I think it's very often, it's no longer the preserve of the emerging markets, but it's also the preserve now of the developed markets to bash up industrialists, bash up bankers, and bash up anybody who creates wealth. Unless we can increase the size of the cake, there is not going to be enough cake going around for including the people at the bottom of the pyramid. Yes, there is a big issue these days in terms of the growing Gini coefficient, which is the gap between the rich and the poor. Clearly, we need to think not about capitalism, but inclusive capitalism. It is no longer good just to go for headline GDP growth. We need to look about pattern of growth, not just pace of growth. We need to look at how we divvy up the spoils. But I think it's time for governments to think about the role that businesses can and do play. But equally, I think the onus is on businesses to explain better what they do. Because when you talk to companies and you look at their annual reports, they will have a section called CSR, which talks about the contributions they have made. There is very little they do to demonstrate what their business does for the economy at large. So if you take banking industry, I think banks have done a poor job of explaining the social usefulness of what they do. Equally, banks have done a useless job, by and large, of putting a mirror to themselves and saying, are the activities we are doing socially useful? So for instance, at Standard Chartered, just this year, we have launched an audit because our brand promise is here for good. We want to test it for ourselves that every activity that we do in our core business is actually here for good.
Thank you very much. Before I ask Nick to respond to my Nigerian colleague from Dangote, we'll be really interested in hearing from any policymakers here, any ministers, any politicians from that world. No one has asked any questions, and I'd encourage you to, please.
Yes, I think you're right. I completely agree. Good corporate social responsibility is good business. It has huge emotional resonance with consumers. It has political potency. It empowers staff and makes them feel that the organization they're working for is investing in its community and putting something back. And all of those things add up to, an incredibly effective business case. And as I said at the beginning, I think that's the virtuous circle. Corporate social responsibility is something that companies have to explain to their shareholders and to their consumers. And so it has to make business sense. And, as the market becomes more sophisticated, I think you will see more and more people making the long-term interventions that you were referring to with Tata.
Nick, I know we're short of time, so I'm going to ask you the question. Does CSR in education work?
Yes.
Mr. Varkey, does CSR in education work?
For sure.
Shankar, same question.
Absolutely.
Tox.
Took the words out of my mouth. Absolutely, it does work.
So given that that's what the panelists think, I'm keen to wrap up by asking you that question and offering you the opportunity to raise your hands in whether you think CSR in education works, given what you've heard and everything that you have experienced in your lifetimes. So if you agree that CSR in education works, please put your hand up. So we'll take a quick poll. I'd say it's even Stevens. Thank you very much for your time. The result shows that only 50% of you actually believe that. And we'd be interested in knowing, as foundations, how you think that companies, charitable foundations, and other entities can actually become more effective in their giving. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.